Hello there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. I recently finished up the foundation paper pieced teapots and I turned those into a quilt because a friend wanted to gift that to her aunt. I had a little bit of the backing fabric left over, that beautiful purple cafe fabric in the background there. I'm pulling out some various scraps that I think will go with this. I asked my friend if she wanted me to make her a little zipper pouch, and she said sure, she would take a zipper pouch. So I wanted to use some of that cafe fabric so she would have a memory of this quilt as well. I had this teal binding left over from my heritage quilt. I'm going to press that leftover binding open, and what I'm going to be doing is cutting 2.5-inch squares from this teal fabric as well as that cafe purple fabric. And I need some extra bits for the back of the zipper bag and the inside of the zipper bag. Not quite sure yet what I'm going to use. If you look up in the top left, you'll see I do have a little bit of 2.5-inch folded in half and pressed of black fabric. That's going to be the binding for this zipper pouch. But first, let's get some 2.5-inch squares cut. When I had enough squares, I laid them out on some extra batting, 5 across and 4 down, so a total of 20 squares. I found the fabric that I wanted to use for the lining, and I cut out fabric and batting that would be big enough for the front and the back of the bag. To make the front of the bag, I am sewing almost a checkerboard with the light turquoise and the dark purple cafe fabric in alternating colors, and I'm going to be making a grid that is 5 across and 4 down. After I separated the first 10 pairs, I started stitching pairs together to make 4. Next, I took the time to press each of these little strips of 4 going the same direction, because that way when I stitch them together to make my checkerboard grid, the seams should nest. Now it's time to stitch 2 of these little strips together, making sure the colors are opposite. When I had 2 of these sets, I pressed them flat and went ahead and stitched those together into a 4x4 grid. And last, I added 1 more strip of 4 to the end to make it 5x4. Once I had that last row put on, I pressed it nice and flat. Then it was time to sandwich my front, my batting, and my lining together and do the quilting. To do the quilting for the front of this bag, I simply sewed down one side of each seam line about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam, and then I went down the opposite side and stitched about 1/8 of an inch away on the other side of the seam line. Here's what that looks like after doing all the lines in one direction. I'm going to go back over this again and do all the seams in the opposite direction. With all the stitch lines done, I trimmed right to the edge of my squares. The next thing to do is stitch on a zipper. I'm using a basic nylon zipper. I'm going to put this zipper right sides together with the front of my bag, and I am going to swap out my foot for my zipper foot, and I'm going to try and stitch as close to the zipper as I can. Once that's stitched down, I'm going to fold it back upon itself. I'm going to press that seam nice and flat, and then I'm going to stitch down that off side of the zipper. And unfortunately, I did not get the video of me stitching down that seam. If you look closely here, you can see where I did run a stitch line to stitch that zipper down. Now, I've got a piece of my 2.5-inch aqua teal strip, and I'm going to stitch that right sides together with the zipper to make the top over where the zipper is. Now, I did make a mistake here. I should have had the folded edge here where the zipper foot is instead of the raw edge. So you'll see in a minute when I finish this seam, I have to trim away some of that raw edge. So I'm folding this little strip of leftover binding that I stitched down. I'm folding it back away from the zipper. That's going to make the top of the front of the bag. And then I'll be stitching down that loose edge of the zipper on the back side. Now, if this had been the folded edge, I wouldn't have had to trim away those raw edges. It would have looked just fine, but there were lots of loose threads and things like that showing. So I am going in here and trimming away from that raw edge to hide it behind where I stitched down the zipper. Now it's time to pick some fabric for the back of the bag. I found this beautiful blue floral, but it wasn't quite big enough, so I'm going to attach a piece of that cape fabric to it to make it big enough. I pressed that seam nice and flat. I pressed a rectangle of the lining fabric, and I cut off a piece of batting of an appropriate size, made my quilt sandwich, and started quilting the back of the bag. I swapped my zipper foot back out for my regular foot, and I started quilting diagonal lines all one direction. Here's a close-up look at that quilting. The next thing I did was measure the front of my bag. it turned out about 10.5 inches by about 9.5 inches. Your measurements could vary, so just measure what you have and then make sure the back of the bag is exactly the same. I trimmed the back of the bag to the exact measurement I needed. Then, making sure my zipper pull was inside the bag, I trimmed off the two sides of the zipper. The next thing I did was stitch a label on the back of this little zip bag. My daughter-in-law got me some cute little quilt labels and project labels, and I thought I'd put one on this little zip bag for my friend. I'm using a blanket stitch to tack down this label. Now, to hold everything in place, I put the front and the back of my bag together with the lining to the inside, and I stitched all the way around the outside of this super sandwich, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. And this was just to hold everything in place until I could do the binding. I'm going to start my binding just like I always do. I'm going to fold down at a 45-degree angle, then fold back down on the crease, give it a nice press. I'm going to stitch this binding to the back of the little zipper bag past my pocket. I start a little bit past my pocket, so I do have room to tuck in the tail end. When I approach a corner, I stop stitching about 1/4 inch away from the edge, then I stitch off to the corner at a diagonal. Next, I fold up that fabric on that 45-degree angle, then fold it back down even with the edge of the side and start stitching again. When I get all the way around, I'm going to trim that tail off to match that angle of my pocket, giving myself just enough to tuck into the pocket. Once I've stitched this binding all the way around to the back, I'm going to flip this binding around to the front of this little zip bag and stitch it down all the way around. For this bag, I am just doing a straight stitch, and I've got a light tan thread in my machine, so these stitches are going to show. You could also consider using maybe a zigzag stitch, a blanket stitch, some other decorative stitch, or hand stitching it if you choose to not have your stitches be seen. Normally, for quilters who do the hand stitching of the binding, they will machine stitch it down to the front of the quilt, then flip the binding around to the back of the quilt and do the hand stitching on the back. I'll leave a link to some quilt finishing videos I've done that show this binding in a little bit more detail. One other thing, if you want to make it a little bit easier on yourself, you could go all the way around this and clip this binding in place, or some people glue it and then iron it and then stitch it down. Well, here is a look at this cute little easy zipper bag. These little bags make great gifts. They're also great stash busters, great scrap busters. You can just throw practically anything together and it is going to look great. If you're liking my content, I invite you to subscribe. Click that bell icon for notifications. Always feel free to leave me a comment. I like to hear from people and see what you think. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope to see you back again real soon.